The illegitimate daughter who outsmarted nobles and built an empire of her own. What if the bastard daughter of a dying woman dared to challenge the entire nobility, and won? Her name was Amara. They called her a mistake. She became an empire. The candle burned low, its wax spilling like tears onto the wooden table where a woman lay struggling for every breath. Her skin was pale, her hands frail, and yet her eyes, though dimmed by illness, still carried the fire of a truth she could no longer keep. She reached out and gripped her daughter's wrist with all the strength she had left, her voice a rasp that trembled against the silence of the night. "You were never meant for this life of shadows," she whispered, her chest rising and falling in painful rhythm. "There is something you must know before I go. Your father is not the man you believe him to be. He is no farmer, no servant, no nameless shadow like us. He is a nobleman, a man of power and wealth who abandoned us to poverty. He cast me aside, but you are his blood." The girl, Amara, froze. For 17 years she had lived as the daughter of nothing, the child of hunger, the shadow of shame. She had known no luxury but the brief warmth of her mother's embrace, no inheritance but the endless labor of survival. The words struck her like thunder. A nobleman, her father, the same men she had only ever seen from afar, passing in gilded carriages while she and her mother worked their fingers to the bone just to keep bread on the table. She wanted to deny it, to call it a fever dream of a dying woman, but the tears spilling down her mother's face were too real. "I wrote to him," her mother confessed, clutching a folded parchment sealed with wax. The last of her trembling strength poured into every word. "I begged him to take you in, to give you the life I could not. If he has any honor left in him, he will not let you be alone." Her eyes searched Amara's, desperate, pleading. "Promise me, my child. Promise me you will go with him, that you will not waste your life in shadows as I did. You must survive, even if it means walking among those who despise you." Amara's throat closed, her tears hot against her cheeks. She wanted to scream that she needed nothing of that man, that they had survived all these years without him. But she saw the truth in her mother's fading gaze. The letter was not just for Amara's future, but for her mother's peace in death. She pressed her lips to her mother's forehead, tasting the salt of her own grief. "I promise," she whispered, though every part of her ached at the words. By dawn, her mother was gone. The earth had barely covered the grave when the sound of hooves shattered the quiet morning. A carriage black as midnight rolled down the dirt path, its wheels crushing the frozen ground. Crest etched in gold gleamed on the door, proof that the letter had been read. Servants in fine livery stepped down, their eyes sharp and cold as they took in the sight of the girl in rags. One of them, his nose wrinkled in disdain, announced, "By command of Lord Davenor, we have come for his daughter." His daughter. The words felt like chains shackled to her wrists. The ride to the estate was a blur of snow and silence. Amara pressed her forehead to the glass, her eyes burning with unshed tears as the world she had known fell away behind her. Her village, her mother's grave, the fields she had worked until her hands bled, all swallowed by distance. Ahead loomed the world of her father, vast and glittering, yet colder than the grave she had just left behind. When the gates of the estate rose before her, she felt no awe. They towered like iron teeth ready to devour her whole. The carriage rumbled inside, and suddenly she was drowning in gold and marble, the scent of perfumes, and the mocking gaze of servants who already whispered of the bastard brought into their master's house. Her father did not greet her with warmth, nor did he embrace her as a long-lost child. He stood tall at the top of the grand staircase, his robes of velvet heavy with jewels, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Amara searched for even a flicker of recognition, of remorse, of love. She found none. His eyes slid over her, as one might regard a painting hung poorly on a wall, acknowledged, but never cherished. "She will stay," he said curtly, his voice carrying no trace of affection. It was her mother's last wish. "See that she is given quarters." And with that, he turned away. Quarters. A word that meant little more than a corner where she would not be seen. At dinner, no seat was prepared for her. She ate in silence, standing near the servants, while her half-sisters giggled behind jeweled fans and whispered words sharp enough to cut flesh. Look at her hair, like straw from the stables. Does she even know how to hold a spoon? Their laughter echoed through the marble halls. The Duchess, her father's wife, did not even deign to acknowledge her existence, as though she were less than a shadow. Amara clenched her fists under the table, her heart burning with shame and fury. Yet she remembered her mother's final words: survive. And so she lowered her gaze, not in submission, but in calculation. Every cruel word, every sneer, every deliberate humiliation etched itself into her memory, not as wounds, but as weapons. She would remember. She would learn. And when the time came, she would turn their cruelty into her strength. That night, alone in the cold room they had given her, Amara lit a candle and stared into its flame. The walls were stone, the bed little softer than the one she had left behind. But the air here carried something different. It carried possibility. She wandered the halls in secret, slipping into the library where shelves of leather-bound tomes towered like monuments. She traced the spines with reverence, drinking in words she was forbidden to read. She listened at the doors of banquets, memorizing the rhythm of noble speech, the currency of secrets exchanged in whispers. She studied not from books alone, but from life itself, for the estate was a theater of power and cruelty, and she its unwilling actress. They thought she was broken. They thought she was nothing but a bastard dragged in by pity. But Amara was not broken. She was steel hidden in the guise of straw, and in the quiet darkness of her chamber, she made a vow that would echo through history. She would rise, not to beg for their acceptance, but to eclipse them all. The mornings in her father's estate were colder than any winter she had known in the village. Not because of the wind that slipped through the tall windows, but because of the silence that greeted her every time she rose. No one came to wake her. No one asked if she had eaten. The servants glanced at her only long enough to remind themselves that she was not one of them, but not noble either. She belonged nowhere. And yet, instead of breaking her, that loneliness became her first weapon. In the stillness of dawn, she walked the corridors alone, memorizing the place that others had ruled all their lives. She counted the steps from the servants' wing to the Duchess's chambers, marked which floorboards betrayed even the softest step, and which doors opened with the faintest push. The estate was a cage, but she studied it until it became a map. The humiliations began early, small enough to be dismissed, sharp enough to bleed. At breakfast, she was not offered a chair at the long table where her half-sisters sat. She stood near the servants, a plate balanced in her hands like a beggar, while the girls giggled behind their fans. "Does she even know which fork to use?" one whispered. "Perhaps she eats with her fingers," the other replied, and their laughter rang out as if she were deaf. Amara lowered her eyes, not because she accepted it, but because she was listening. Every insult became a note in her ledger, every cruel smirk a seed she would one day return to them tenfold. At night, when the estate quieted, she slipped into the library. Her heart raced with every step, afraid the steward would catch her. But her hunger for knowledge outweighed her fear. The books smelled of dust and ink, thick with secrets. She traced the spines with reverence, whispered the words aloud until her tongue bent to their shapes. She began with simple things, stories of saints, hymns in languages long dead. Soon she devoured treatises on trade, laws of the city, the fragile balance of noble alliances. Each page was a torch in the darkness. If she was not allowed tutors, she would tutor herself. Her first real lesson in cruelty came not from books, but from her sisters. One evening she was summoned to bring water to their chambers. The elder sister, Lucienne, tossed her long hair and smirked as Amara poured into a silver basin. "Careful," she said sweetly. "A bastard's hands might sour the water." The younger, Celeste, burst into laughter so shrill it made Amara's ears ache. She wanted to throw the jug into their painted faces, but she remembered her mother's words: survive. She placed the jug down carefully, met Lucienne's eyes only for a heartbeat, and whispered, "Even bitter water quenches thirst." She left before they could answer. but she knew by the silence that followed her out that the arrow had landed. The Duchess was more subtle. She never raised her voice, never dirtied her hands. Instead, she invented new ways to remind Amara she was unwanted. At dinner, she would ask questions that had no safe answers. "Tell me, child, do they teach manners in hovels?" If Amara bowed her head, she appeared weak. If she answered sharply, she appeared insolent. So she learned to respond with words that bent, but never broke. "They teach survival, my lady. A lesson most useful anywhere." Some guests chuckled at her wit. Others sneered. The Duchess narrowed her eyes. From then on, Amara knew that wit was both a weapon and a wound. But not all lessons came from cruelty. In the laundries, where steam choked the air and lye burned the skin, an old widow with hands like rope showed her how to render fat and mix it with ash. The first time Amara plunged her hands into the cauldron, her skin stung, but she endured. She noticed how certain oils softened the water, how herbs changed the scent. She began keeping notes, scratching them on scraps of parchment stolen from the library. She did not know it yet, but those notes were the foundation of her future empire. One winter, her hands cracked and bled from scrubbing floors. She experimented with a mixture of tallow and lavender, and to her surprise, the rash healed. She shared it with the scullery maids, who sighed in relief as the pain faded. "You've got a nose for what people need," the widow told her. Amara smiled faintly, though inside she burned with the knowledge that the nobility would never recognize such a gift. Not yet. The estate itself became her teacher. She watched the butler deal with merchants, saw how a late delivery of wine was smoothed over with gold coins and false smiles. She lingered by stairwells as tutors lectured her sisters on arithmetic, then corrected the numbers in her head, teaching herself what was denied to her. She listened to the fencing master boast about balance and stance, memorizing how a shift in the feet revealed more than a swing of the blade. Even the chaplain, perhaps out of pity, left slim volumes tucked between psalms where only she would find them. A catechism of ethics, a sermon on unjust weights, and finally, a copy of city statutes. She devoured the statutes as if they were holy scripture. And there she discovered her greatest weapon, guild law. A woman could be owned, her fortune swallowed by father or husband. But a guild? A guild was its own master, property of the charter, not of the flesh. If she could one day form one, she would be untouchable. Not every day was triumph. There were defeats that tasted like ashes. At a banquet, a cousin of the Duchess asked loudly, "Tell us, where were you kept before your father showed mercy? In the stables?" The hall erupted in laughter. Amara's cheeks burned, but she forced herself to smile. "In the world outside these walls," she answered softly, "where labor feeds hunger and truth is not hidden behind silk." The cousin's laughter faltered for only a breath, but the punishment came swiftly. The next day he poured wine over her hands in private, muttering, "That is all you're good for, washing." Amara did not flinch. She noted the loose stone in his ring and later heard of his debts to a jeweler. Debts, she realized, are leashes. She began to watch for them everywhere. The first spark of true rebellion came with a dress. For her first supper among the lesser guests, the Duchess promised her a gown. Hours before the event, it vanished. She arrived in her plainest clothing, eyes steady, chin high. The hall whispered, mocked. But when a young marquess asked about the old tapestries on the wall, Amara spoke with quiet authority. She had read about them in the library and knew their origin better than the tutor who claimed to teach her sisters. The marquess smiled, intrigued. Across the hall, the Duchess's hand tightened on her goblet. Amara returned to her chamber with nothing but a tattered dress and a dangerous new certainty. Knowledge could be stolen, but it could not be hidden. Her father remained distant, a shadow of velvet and command. He spoke to her only when necessary, and always to remind her of her place. Stand straighter. Do not linger where you do not belong. Do not imagine you are more than you are. Amara obeyed with precision, but in her silence she built walls of iron. If obedience was demanded, she would wield it like a blade. The steward, sensing her strength, began to watch her. He cut supplies, cheapened oils, allowed the linens to yellow. Complaints rose from the servants, but he shrugged them off. Amara saw opportunity. Quietly, she began slipping her homemade bars of soap into their hands. A footman gave one to his wife. A groom shared with the cook. Soon even the Duchess remarked that the air smelled less like servants. The steward took the credit. Amara smiled. Let him think it was his triumph. She only cared that the roots were hers. The city called to her. On errands she wandered its markets, eyes wide, ears sharper than any merchant's. She saw coarse soaps that cracked skin, lace yellowed by harsh lye, sailors who cursed at the stench that clung to them. She knew she could do better. At the apothecary, she saw jars of lavender sold at the price of miracles. They were not miracles. Miracles happened when need met invention, and she was ready to give the world both. At night she boiled and cooled, mixed and measured, wrapped her bars in waxed paper sealed with candle stubs. Her first success was humble, a soap that lasted twice as long and left no burns. She traded it to a candle maker for wax, to a dyer for scraps of cloth, to a seamstress for word of mouth. Slowly her bars spread like whispers. A letter A stamped into each one became her mark. At first, no one noticed. Then the wives of craftsmen began to ask for it by name. The A was no longer just a letter, it was a promise. Her father tried to end it before it began. One spring he summoned her to his study. "A proposal has been made," he said flatly. "A minor lord. Good land. You will be wed before summer. It will silence the talk." He looked past her as he spoke, as if she were already gone. Amara bowed, hiding the fury in her chest. That night, by candlelight, she read the guild statutes until her eyes blurred. She wrote a charter, found witnesses among those she had helped. The candlemaker, the dyer, even the old priest who smiled as he pressed his seal. Within a fortnight, her company was real. A woman could be married off, but a guild belonged to itself. When her father presented the marriage contract, she placed the guild charter before him. "A company?" he spat. "You are a child scribbling fantasies." He waved the parchment, then froze. It bore a seal, it bore witnesses, it bore law. For the first time, his eyes met hers, and there was something other than disdain. There was fear. Amara left the study with the charter clutched to her chest. She had not won, not yet, but she had drawn her first true weapon. Her sister still mocked, the Duchess still plotted, the nobles still sneered. Yet beyond the walls of the estate, in the bustling heart of the city, people were already whispering about a new soap that healed hands, that made lace brighter, that carried a mark of promise. The illegitimate daughter was no longer just surviving. She was building an empire. The first whispers reached her before she realized her name had left the shadows. At the marketplace, she overheard two merchants arguing over a shipment of soap. "The bars with the mark," one insisted. "They sell faster than anything I stock." The other spat. "That mark belongs to a bastard girl. You'd risk angering her father?" Amara pretended to study apples, her heart hammering. They were speaking of her in the open, as if she were already a force to reckon with. It thrilled her and terrified her. But whispers travel faster than fire in noble halls. Within weeks, the Duchess knew. At supper, she fixed Amara with a smile so sharp it could cut glass. "I hear the markets are filthy these days," she said, her jeweled fingers toying with her goblet. "So many commoners hawking soap, perfumes, trinkets. One almost forgets the dignity of true craftsmanship." The guests tittered. Amara kept her voice soft. "Sometimes the commoners remember what the nobles forget, that dignity does not cleanse dirty hands." A few guests laughed louder than politeness allowed. The Duchess's smile tightened. That night, Amara returned to her chamber to find her notes torn, her samples smashed. She wept only once, silently, then began again before dawn. Her father summoned her soon after. His study smelled of ink and tobacco, the heavy curtains drawn. "You shame me," he said, his voice cold. "Merchants gossip that my daughter sells soaps like a washerwoman. Do you not understand what damage you do to this house? Amara held her ground. It is not shame to build what others cannot destroy. Even you, Father, cannot erase the mark that is already known. His fist struck the desk, rattling the inkwell. You will stop this foolishness. I will not have nobles whisper that my blood toils in the market like a common thief. She met his eyes with steady fire. Then you should have left me in the hut with my mother, for it was there I learned that survival is not shame. It was the first time she had spoken to him as an equal. It was also the last time he allowed her to leave the study without punishment. From then on, she was watched. Servants reporting her movements, carriages denied, letters intercepted. But she had learned that confinement was only a wall for those who lacked imagination. She paid the cook's nephew to smuggle parcels through the kitchen door. She slipped coins to the laundress to ferry messages hidden in baskets of linen. Her products reached the market even when her father thought he had caged her. The nobles responded with sharper teeth. Her soaps began to vanish from stalls, stolen before customers could buy them. Rumors spread that they caused rashes, that they carried curses. A merchant who stocked them was fined mysteriously by the guildmaster of chandlers. Another was denied credit by a banker tied to the Duke of Veyron. Amara saw the pattern at once. The nobility was not mocking her now. They were afraid. She decided to strike back not with denial, but with demonstration. One evening she appeared uninvited at a lesser noble's banquet, dressed not in silk, she had none, but in a plain gown embroidered with her own hands. The hall fell silent as she entered, whispers hissing like snakes. She carried a small basin and a single bar of soap. Before the stunned guests, she knelt beside a knight whose hands were cracked and bloodied from campaign. "My lord," she said softly, "allow me." She washed his hands in the basin, the scent of lavender rising through the hall. The knight blinked in astonishment as the stinging eased. "By God," he murmured, "the pain is gone." The room erupted in murmurs. The Duchess's cousin hissed, "Witchcraft." But the knight lifted Amara's hand and kissed it before all. No witchcraft. A gift. By the end of the night, half the ladies had begged for a bar. The next morning, the Duchess forbade her from ever leaving the estate. Guards were posted at the gates, and her father raged that she had humiliated him by displaying herself like a tradeswoman. But Amara had planted the seed she needed. Nobles themselves now wanted her work. They could mock her birth, but they could not mock results. Her sisters, sensing danger to their own place, grew bolder in their cruelty. Lucienne once cornered her in the gallery, sneering, "Do you think a soap makes you equal to us? You are nothing but dirt polished to a shine, and when father marries you off, you will scrub some lord's chamber pot, nothing more." Amara's lips curved into a smile that chilled her sister. "If I am dirt, then remember, dirt buries. One day, Lucienne, you will beg to be polished." The attacks escalated. Her ledgers were stolen, her suppliers threatened. Once, returning from the market, she found her carriage overturned, her goods destroyed. "Bandits," the steward claimed. She recognized the crest carved into the discarded blade, a baron allied to her father. They wanted to frighten her into retreat. Instead, she walked to the chapel that night, knelt before the altar and whispered, "If the nobles wish to play as wolves, then I must learn to be fire." And fire she became. She diversified her products, creating oils for hair, salves for soldiers' wounds, scents that lingered in the chambers of courtesans. She partnered with those no noble would dare cross, the captains of the docks, the guildmasters of masons, the wives of judges. Slowly, her empire spread beneath the surface, invisible threads tightening until half the city carried a piece of her work. She no longer begged entry to noble halls. The nobles, unknowingly, had already let her in, through their servants, their soldiers, their mistresses. Her father struck again with law. He petitioned the magistrates, claiming all her profits as his by right of paternity. She stood before the court, the hall filled with lords eager to see her fall. The magistrate asked, "By what authority does a woman claim independence from her father's house?" Amara laid the guild charter upon the desk, its seal unbroken, its witnesses firm. "By the authority of the law you wrote, my lord. You may despise my birth, but even you cannot despise your own statutes." A murmur rippled through the hall. The magistrate frowned, but the charter was sound. Her father left the court red with fury. That day, Amara walked out not as an illegitimate daughter, but as a guild master in her own right. The nobles had failed to silence her, but their hatred only grew. Invitations to banquets ceased, marriage proposals dried, rumors swelled darker than before. Some whispered she had bewitched half the city. Others claimed she poisoned her products with herbs of the grave. Amara listened and smiled, because beneath the poison of their words lay the truth. They feared her. And yet, even fear has teeth. One autumn evening, as she prepared for market, a fire broke out in her workshop. Flames devoured her shelves, smoke choked the air, goods turned to ash. Neighbors rushed to help, but it was too late. She stood in the ruins, her face streaked with soot, her hands trembling. For a moment, despair threatened to swallow her. This, she knew, was not accident. It was war. But war had always been her language. And as the nobles plotted her ruin, she vowed to rise again, stronger, sharper, and unstoppable. The clash had only begun. The fire took quickly, as if it had been waiting for a match. It chewed the rafters to black ribs and licked the windows to mirrors of orange. Amara staggered into the alley with her forearms wrapped in a wet shawl, coughing until stars pricked the edges of her vision. Neighbors formed a chain with buckets, faces silvered by smoke and moonlight. But by the time the flames surrendered to steam, the workshop was a charred mouth gaping at the night. The widow from the laundries found her sitting on a crate, hands black, eyes bright and strangely dry. "Cry if you must," the widow said, "then stand." Amara shook her head. "I stood first," she answered hoarsely. "Now I'll build." At dawn, the smell of wet ash clung to the lane. Beneath the ruin, she found little worth salvaging: warped molds, a cracked kettle, stamps warped into crescents. But when she lifted the floorboards where she had hidden her ledger, the book came up dry. She opened it with trembling care. The ink had not run. Names waited where she had left them: chandlers, dyers, a seamstress with more clients than ours, a mason's wife who swore the salve kept her husband at his work through winter. At the back, 3 pages of ratios, experiments, failures turned to formulas, notes from the widow's mouth written in Amara's hand. The ledger was a living thing. They had burned her walls. They had not burned her mind. The city woke to the gossip of smoke twined with rumors of her ruin. Amara washed at the pump until her skin stung clean, tied her hair with a strip of cloth that still held the ghost of lavender, and walked the ledger from door to door. She did not ask for pity. She quantified loss and promised gain. To the dyer she said, "You lose 2 men a season to burned hands. My bars cut that in half." To the chandler, "If your boys don't split their skin, they work through frost." To the seamstress, "Your lace will yellow again without my recipe." She offered what nobles called vulgar and merchants called obvious terms. If they advanced coin for raw tallow and ash, she would repay in product at discount until the debt was gone. If they advanced nothing, she would accept dried herbs and wax ends and return finished goods in a week. The widow stood at her elbow, nodding at every number. "You can smell a bargain," the chandler said grudgingly. "I can smell fear," Amara said, "and I don't have enough of it to stop." They rebuilt where the nobles would least expect, under their noses in a warehouse the dockmaster called a shed, and Amara called a sanctuary. It belonged to no lord and sat on no manor roll. It paid a modest fee to a guild of carters who wanted coin more than permission. The roof leaked in polite weather and roared in storms, but the river lay a stone's throw away, and barges brought ash and fat faster than carts ever had. The widow directed the first kettles like a general. A dyer's apprentice hammered new molds from scraps of tin. The candlemaker brought the boy with the good eye for stamping, and together they carved a new mark, the same A as before, enclosed now by a ring of 7 tiny points, like a crown broken and remade. The boy smiled at the design. "Looks like you stole a crown," he said. "No," Amara answered. "I forged one no man can wear for me." She did not merely replace what the fire had eaten, she altered it. The old formula had been good, gentle on skin, stingless in frost, but rebuilding was a chance to banish the last of chance. She reworked the ratios with rainwater collected in tall jars wrapped in linen, filtered through charcoal crushed in a mortar until it whispered. She rendered tallow twice, then a third time at lower heat until it gleamed. She traded a batch to an apothecary for a measure of citrus peel oil so dear it came with 2 apologies. A drop cut grease like a blade. She steeped rosemary cold and lavender warm, learning what broke and what bent beneath time. She tested bars on her own raw knuckles, then on the widow's rope-worn wrists, then on the chandler's little girl, who giggled at the bubbles as if they were a festival all their own. When the first flawless batch cooled, the bars looked like cream petrified into useful promise. Opposition returned, of course. A man in a fine cloak waited in the alley one evening, hat brim low, breath sweet with a noble's wine. "There are powerful interests who would see this endeavor end," he said pleasantly, as though inviting her to tea. "Sell the mark, and they will forget you." Amara watched steam curl from a cooling pan. "If they could forget me, you would not be here," she replied. "Tell your interests to wash their hands. They'll need my bars before winter." He left with a half bow that was almost respect. The next week, a magistrate's clerk arrived with a paper full of stamps and accusations. Violations of storage codes, unlawful employment of guild labor, unsafe kettles. Amara stood with her charter in hand. "We are a registered company," she said, calm as balanced scales. "If fire laws are newly dear to the city, we shall welcome inspection at every warehouse, beginning with those owned by Lord Halvern and the Duchy of Veyron." The clerk's ears colored. "Perhaps," he said, "we will begin here." They did, and left with nothing but clean palms and the involuntary sigh that rises when fear fails to find purchase. The products multiplied because needs did. Sailors swore by a salt-hardened bar that rinsed brine and pitch without stealing skin. Midwives blessed a mild wash that spared infants the rash of rough linen. Soldiers lined up for a salve that shut their wounds' mouths and a soap that shaved without blood. For the wives of judges and the bored ladies who pretended not to know her name, Amara brewed a perfume built not to conquer a room, but to linger like a rumor near the throat. Rosemary for memory, orange blossom for ease. A whisper of smoke so the sweetness never turned cloying. She priced it not as a jewel, but as something a seamstress could buy for herself after 3 good days' work. Nobles were outraged that their chambermaids smelled finer than their duchesses. Merchants were delighted to profit from the outrage. With work came people. Amara hired the unhirable. Laundresses with scarred hands, seamstresses with tired eyes, girls dismissed from service for speaking truth, boys turned away from guild apprenticeships because their fathers had the wrong names. She paid on time and in coin, and sometimes in bread and candles when coin ran thin, and she posted the rates on the wall where every worker could read them. "They'll say you spoil them," the widow warned. "I will say I remember," Amara answered. She rotated tasks so no back broke in the same way for too many days. She set aside the first hour after dawn for lessons, letters, sums, enough law to know a contract's teeth. A mason's son, once deaf to words, learned to sign his name with pride, then to copy invoices with care. A girl with eyes like winter sky learned to add faster than the clerk who came to count. "You're teaching them to leave you," a carter grumbled, half admiring. "I'm teaching them to stay because they can leave," Amara said. "That is a different kind of bond." Success made enemies inventive. One market morning, a crate arrived, stamped with her own circled crown. Inside lay bars that looked like hers and behaved like spite. They burned skin raw. An old trick, counterfeit to poison trust. Amara's jaw went cold. She took 3 bars, marched to the fountain at the square's center, and broke them under a hammer so the crowd could see the lies inside. Too much lie, cheap fats that went rancid by noon. "These are not mine," she said, voice raised so it carried to balconies. "Mine smell like work finished and pain eased. Mine carry this mark." She held up the new stamp and pressed it into a fresh-wrapped cake, indelible, and the names of those who made them. She gestured to the workers lined behind her, faces smudged, eyes bright. "If you have a complaint with any bar stamped by these hands, bring it to me. I will replace it twice." A silence hung, then broke into applause, human and noisy. The counterfeiters did not come forward. They never do. But their crates stopped appearing, and her name left the square taller than it had entered. All the while, her father gathered shadow into a rope. He could not own her company by statute, so he sought to own the world around it. He reminded the Duchess's relations that scandal stains, and winced publicly on their behalf. He suggested to a banker that some borrowers' accounts might become difficult if the wrong products continued to be stocked. He dined with guildmasters who preferred coin to law, and left the table lighter by both. He pulled levers Amara could not see, and the world answered with the slow drag of a wheel that someone had jammed a stick into. Deliveries arrived late. The rent for the riverside shed doubled. A barge was lost, though 3 dockhands swore they had seen it tied and sound the night before. Amara did not pretend she could push the wheel alone. She walked to the docks at noon, the hour when men want to eat and do not want to listen, and stood on a barrel until voices dropped. "If you will not tie your future to a noble's whim," she called, "tie it to mine. I cannot promise you favor. I can promise you work that pays what it says, and soap that takes pitch from your hands in 2 turns. I can promise you that when the winter comes, I will not cut your hours to feed a lord's pride." They did not cheer. Dockmen rarely did. But 3 foremen came that night to the shed with ledgers under their coats, and in their signatures Amara found something rarer than applause: alignment. She bought a second space, smaller, up the hill where floods could not reach. She did so with coin, and with a trick learned from those who thought she would never read. She split the lease across 2 allied names, one of which belonged to a widow, the other to a mason's wife. When the steward tried to claim she could not rent as a woman, she did not need to answer. 2 women with husbands in guilds did that for her. "We are tenants," they said crisply, tapping the contract. "We pay. Your master's temper doesn't alter the sums." The steward left with a color in his face that did not match his livery. The perfume was the hinge on which the door truly swung wide. It began as a comfort for women who could not afford boredom. It became an obsession for women who could. A single lord's mistress bought a vial and brought it to a salon hosted by the very Duchess who wanted Amara erased. "What is that?" the Duchess asked, nostrils flaring. "Something from Veyron?" The mistress smiled like a fox. "From the riverside. It smells like remembering a name after years of forgetting." Within a week, carriages rolled to alleys they had never noticed before, curtains drawn, coins wrapped in handkerchiefs, so no household ledger should record the purchase. The nobles had been the last to want her wares. Now they wanted them most, and they wanted them quietly. Nothing is louder than a secret everyone shares. The fire returned in another shape, a sickness that crept through late autumn. The city coughed. Men who hauled and hammered stayed home. Women who washed could not taste. Amara's salves were no cure, but her milder soaps eased skin rubbed raw by endless rinsing. She set a barrel in the square with a painted sign, "Free for those who serve the sick." "You'll go broke," the candlemaker warned. "I'll go known," she answered, and known keeps the door open for paid work when the fever breaks. It broke in winter, and when shutters opened again, the first coin many households spent was on the scent that reminded them they had survived. Her father came to the shed for the first time when snow lay in the yard like unlaundered linen. He did not knock. His coat rejected the wet-like authority, rejects please. "Enough," he said, stepping between kettles as if they owed him space. "You will end this and accept the marriage I have negotiated. The man has debts, yes, but he has a name. He will make you respectable." Amara wiped her hands on a cloth and considered the man who had fetched her from a grave, and thought that meant he owned the body that climbed out. "Respectable to whom?" she asked. "To the people who close their windows when the city coughs? To the ones who send boys to haul and hide their names in ledgers? Respectable is a word for men to use when they mean obedient. He stared past her shoulder, as he always had. I will not be mocked by a girl I never meant to have. She gestured to the workers lining the wall, pausing in their tasks because Law had entered the room like a draft. You are being refused, she said simply. There is a difference. He tried the courts again. He tried gossip sharper than a sword. He tried starving her of supplies until the dockman refused him service. He tried fear, and when fear failed, he tried pity, sending word that he was ill. He was not ill. He was finally learning the limits of a name. The Duchess stopped inviting him to dinners where her floor smelled faintly of rosemary and smoke. Her friends preferred the comfort to the drama. He found himself standing in doorways no longer opened from the other side. Amara did not crow when she saw the change. She added a third shed instead, behind a tannery where the stink hid the scent of success. She hired a clerk with a clean hand and a scar that said he had once lost a sword, and perhaps a cause. She began to write contracts that other cities could read, terms for river carriage to the north, to the sea, to a duchy that pretended to be distant, and was, in ledger lines, very near. She wrote them in simple language because power loves fog. She preferred weather that shows you the road. On the night her first wagons rolled out under a crisp moon, the widow stood beside her and squeezed her arm. You did it, she said. Amara shook her head. I started it. The wagons creaked, chains gentle, wheels greased with fat that had once been waste. Boys ran after them and fell back laughing. A girl in a doorway lifted her chin and breathed in air that smelled not of ash, but of work completed. The nobles would strike again. They always did. But when the wagons returned laden with coin and orders written in hands she had never seen, even the Duchess's gossip could not slow the wheel. The city had learned to wash in her name. And power, for the first time in Amara's life, cleaned under its nails before it reached for her throat. The final blow came as most betrayals do, dressed in elegance, sealed with wax, and delivered under the guise of honor. A parchment stamped with the council's crest arrived at her door, summoning Amara to a solemn audience. The letter spoke of regulating the city's economy after the fever of autumn, but its true ink was poison. It was a trap, one designed to end her defiance once and for all. She went anyway. One does not run from a hall when one already knows every exit. The council chamber was a cathedral of authority, heavy with beeswax and dust. Nobles lined the front rows, magistrates filled the middle benches, and guildmasters watched from the shadows at the back. Her father sat among them, his shoulders still proud but thinner, as if years of bitterness had eaten him hollow. The Duchess wore pale silk and a smile sharpened to a knife. Beside them, a treasury counselor thumbed through a stack of documents, his fingers soft from ink and indulgence, never from work. The proceedings began with pompous words strung like beads: stability, tradition, hierarchy. Then came the accusations, each one more venomous than the last. Her company had destabilized guild structures. Her workers were illegally employed. Her products were unsafe and unregulated. Finally, her father rose, his voice a thunder meant for theater. This girl, though clever, is still my blood. She is subject to my authority until a husband claims her. I demand that this reckless enterprise be dissolved and her fortune returned to its rightful house. It was a performance. Rehearsed, rehearsed, rehearsed. Every phrase dripped with false nobility. Amara let him finish, her face unreadable. Then she rose, not hurried, not trembling, but with the stillness of a storm waiting to break. First, she laid before them the parchment of her guild charter, stamped with seals that even the council could not dismiss. Murmurs rippled like wind through tall grass. Then, she produced a second document, testimonies from dyers, chandlers, masons' wives, and dock foremen. Men and women of the city had signed that her contracts were fair, her wages honest, her goods of unmatched quality. She unrolled a third parchment, a letter from the city's own physician, sealed with the crest of the hospital, confirming that since her soaps had reached the wards, wounds healed faster, infections spread slower, infants survived winters unscarred. They call me disorder, Amara said, her voice calm, steady, caring to every corner of the hall. Yet where disease festered, I brought relief. Where merchants cheated, I weighed with honesty. Where nobles feasted, I fed workers with bread earned by their own hands. If this is scandal, then I ask, will the people prefer scandal or survival? A long silence followed. Then, from the back, a dock worker rose, his hands scarred and raw from years of salt. We prefer her. The chamber quivered. Whispers cascaded like falling stones. The Treasury Counselor cleared his throat, scrambling to recover. He wielded the blade of taxation. And yet, what of her accounts? What of the city's due? Does this woman think herself above the Treasury? Amara met his gaze and unrolled her final weapon, a proposed contract with the crown itself. The terms were plain and sharp: standardized supply of soap for hospitals and regiments, fair taxes calculated transparently, and public records posted in the square each quarter, read aloud for all who could not read themselves. "If the common good is what you demand," she said, "then here it is, written, sealed, and ready." They had expected her to defend. Instead, she attacked, not with rage, but with reason no law could twist. Her father rose again, desperate. "My daughter," he pleaded, as though the word might stitch 17 years of absence, "is naive. She is manipulated by lesser minds. She cannot stand alone." Amara cut him with silence first, then words. "When hunger came, you were not there. When fire took my first workshop, you were not there. When the fever swept this city, you were not there. You speak of blood, but blood that abandons is no claim at all." The magistrates called for recess. Nobles clustered in corners, whispering venom through silk. The Duchess fanned herself with fury disguised as elegance. Amara descended the steps into the courtyard, where the widow waited with hands folded over her apron. "If you fall," the old woman said softly, "fall standing." Amara touched her hand. "If I fall, I will fall opening doors." When the council returned, the verdict was clear, though wrapped in formality. The company was recognized as a public necessity, bound by a 5-year contract with renewal contingent upon transparency. For the first time, the title of guildmistress was entered into the records, a legal crack in the stone wall of male dominion. As for her father's claim of guardianship, the magistrate recited with deliberate slowness, "A father cannot claim ownership of a charter he did not sign, labor he did not perform, or wages he did not pay. In this matter, the father is nothing." The words landed like the closing of a tomb. Retaliation followed, of course. Nobles withdrew credit. Gossip blackened her name. Counterfeit products flooded markets. A noblewoman sneered that her perfume smelled of kitchens. But the wheel was already turning. Hospitals received crates marked with her crowned A. Soldiers shaved without blood. Dock workers washed salt from their wounds and went back to labor. Ordinary wives bought her soaps proudly, their homes fragrant with survival. And survival, when it becomes habit, is stronger than any crown. The true coronation came not from silk or jewels, but from floodwater. Heavy rains drowned the port, swallowing warehouses and homes. Nobles hid in carriages, merchants counted their losses. Amara arrived with her workers, ropes, kettles, and carts of soap. She boiled water in the square, built tents for the displaced, pressed bars into the hands of men digging through mud and mothers clutching fevered children. A magistrate passed, soaked and broken, and she gave him a bar as well. "The city will need whole hands to rebuild," she said. He nodded like a man who had finally learned a language he should have known all his life. From that day, the city no longer whispered her name. It spoke it openly, with respect, with gratitude, with pride. The council renewed her contract for 10 years. Other women came, laundresses, seamstresses, abandoned daughters, asking for guild charters of their own. Amara opened a school above her second workshop, not a finishing school for ladies, but a school of survival. Reading, numbers, contracts, trade. Over its door she carved her mother's words, "So no one ever asks permission from hunger again." Her father came once more, years later, thinner, paler, humbled by time and consequence. He spoke of regrets, of weakness, of words unsaid. Amara listened, her face steady. "Regret is no coin," she told him. "If you would pay a debt, pay it to the city." She handed him a contract for a fund to support hospitals and midwives. He signed with a trembling hand and left smaller than he had arrived. Her sisters came too, years later, when vanity had soured into loneliness. They came asking for her soaps, then her counsel. Amara did not grant reconciliation. She granted them goods wrapped in ribbons, priced as for any customer. Power, she had learned, was not in vengeance. It was in being undeniable. And love, when it came gently. Not a prince, but a man with ink-stained fingers and eyes that truly listened. He read her contracts with her, not for her. He asked for partnership, not possession. Their wedding was held in a chapel crowded with workers and guild masters, the vows spoken not over crowns, but over ledgers and calloused hands. Her inventions spread like ripples across water. Ships returned from voyages with fewer dead. Soldiers marched cleaner, mothers birthed safer, children laughed longer. Other cities sent envoys, eager to license her formulas. And always, the crowned A traveled further than rumor. One summer evening, Amara stood on the mezzanine of her workshop, watching wagons roll out beneath the gold of dusk. Below, the widow taught a new apprentice to test soap by touch. Workers folded papers with quick hands. Children scribbled sums on slates. The world had shifted, not with a sword, but with a woman who refused to kneel. She touched the railing, remembered the dirt floor of her childhood hut, the grave of her mother, the fire, the flood, the hunger, the laughter of sisters, the silence of her father. She remembered the first bar of soap, humble and perfect as a prayer. A smile spread, not of victory but of certainty. Her vengeance had carried her far, but it was no longer vengeance that guided her. It was vision. And as long as she breathed, that vision would demand space. Later, a young mother came to her door, weary and trembling, a child pressed to her chest. "They told me," she said, voice breaking, "that here, a woman doesn't have to apologize for existing." Amara placed a bar in her hands and guided her inside. "Here," she answered, "you learn to exist so fiercely that the world must move aside." That night, Amara sat by the fountain in the square where she once shattered false soaps before a crowd. And as the city glowed with her name whispered in perfumes and soap, Amara knew this was only the beginning. Because when a woman builds an empire from ashes, the world doesn't just remember her, it fears who she might inspire next.